Public courtroom, a public courtroom. Generally, we consider it as open to all people. But what happens if one of the parties in a civil trial is excluded from a public courtroom? Well, that brings us to this week's case. A while ago, on one of our video blogs, we talked about a criminal case in which someone who was accused of crime was going in for sentencing, and his friends and neighbors were excluded from the trial. And on appeal, the appellate court found that that was wrong, that his friends and neighbors should be allowed to come in and testify on his behalf at a sentencing in a criminal case. Now, in criminal cases, the rules are a little different, and the main reason the rules are a little different is that you have the state. When I say the state, I'm talking about government, whether it's the federal government, the state government, a county, whatever else, is using all its might and power against a single individual. And very specific rules apply in criminal cases because, as I say, it's the state against a single individual. And one of the things that's very important is that that trial and all proceedings related to it take place in public, so we all know what took place in that case when the state, with all its power and influence, was bringing an action against someone, was bringing criminal charges. But in the civil case, a little different ballgame. Usually you have two people, they get into a hassle. Maybe one says, hey, you drove a car negligently, you caused me injury. Maybe you've got somebody who is in a dispute over a property line. Maybe you have some other issue that exists in which you have a private person bringing a claim against another private person. What about cases like that? Well, as I say, that brings us to this week's case. Involved a case in Georgia, and there we had a very unfortunate situation. It was a little girl who was born, and she was born with horrible birth defects. Her parents said the reason she had these terrible birth defects was because the doctor did a poor job on delivering the child at the time of birth. That he used a C-section, and when he realized that the child was in fetal distress, he did not apply oxygen in time, and they alleged that as a result of that, the child suffered brain damage, was rendered what was diagnosed as basically a spastic quadriplegic, and she was unable to speak. And she also had difficulty processing knowledge. So, bad shape this poor little girl was in. When the trial came along, a couple years later, the little girl was in the courtroom. And the judge ruled that the little girl could not be in the courtroom, couldn't be in the courtroom, because he said she would unnecessarily bias the jury, because they would see her in her completely incapacitated state. They would be very sympathetic to her, and as a result, he, the judge, felt that that would cause them to favor her in the trial. So he excluded this little girl from the courtroom. Well, on appeal, it went up to the Georgia Supreme Court, and there the court looked at it and they said, hey, wait a second. In a civil trial where you've got one person suing another person, now in this instance, the little girl was represented by her parents through what are referred to as guardian ad litem. Her parents were basically acting on her behalf, but essentially it was her suit, so she was the party. And the court came away saying that when you've got two parties in a case, and they are there in a courtroom, both parties have a right to be there, and excluding one party from the courtroom basically does not ensure a fair trial, and it doesn't embrace the full procedure that's necessary when one party sues another party. Okay, so what did we learn from this case? And what did we learn from our prior case involving a criminal defendant? What we learned is that when people go to trial, they have a right to be there. They who are going to trial have a right to be there. And in a civil case, it is particularly important that the parties that are involved in that case, whether they're a defendant, whether they are in this instance, the plaintiff who is bringing the case, they have a right to be there. Now, they can choose not to be there. And in some instances, in civil cases, such involving a high-profile divorce or something, the court can exclude observers, but the parties have a right to be there. Now, in a criminal case, we, the people, always have a right to be there and see what's going on in a criminal trial, and also when a person's being sentenced Their friends, their neighbors who want to be there on their behalf have a right to be there. The courts are open. The courts are for the people. It's something we learned today. It's something that we need to remember. I'm David Allen.